Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT TV's In-Depth series. My name is Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNAT TV. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Today is Thursday, March 8th, and we're also pleased to be joined here in the studio by two folks who are no strangers to the GNAT TV studio. Reilly is a GNAT contributor who's done several shows here over the past year or so, and Cherise Madigan is a freelance journalist who has also appeared here several times. Ladies, great to have you with us on this snowy morning.
Thanks for having us.
Our topic today is free speech and the state of free speech in the United States in 2018. Last year saw several incidences on college campuses and elsewhere where the notion of free speech seemed to come under some kind of attack or assault by those who felt they had a different point of view. So here today to talk about that a little bit, these two folks, and we're going to chat about that and see what we can unpack around that whole subject. And Carly, I guess I'll look to you to get started here. You did a couple of shows last year, and actually they were the inspiration for this show here. Once Upon a Political Time, those shows addressed that question of free speech. So I guess I just wondered, what is it we mean when we say free speech? Is it unlimited free speech? Are there some points where free speech becomes something that should be checked? And I guess what is the Constitution and the Supreme Court? What have they defined free speech as?
So the First Amendment is the amendment that protects speech in this country, and it basically says that Congress shall make no laws abridging freedom of speech. And how we interpret that today is, as long as speech doesn't present a clear and present danger, we say it's accepted under our laws. And that clear and present danger language really was introduced in the 1920s by Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a Supreme Court justice. And prior to that, there was a much more sort of blasé sort of sense of protection over free speech. And you had a situation where essentially free speech wasn't protected at all the way we protect it now. And you were allowed to, you could say anything you wanted, but then you could be punished for saying something that the government didn't like, which of course is very anathema to us now. So we've had this real progression in terms of how we interpret that First Amendment.
Okay, well, what did both of you think last year? It seemed like we had a number of incidences, one at Middlebury College, other college campuses around the country, the situation down in Charlottesville, Virginia, that kind of highlighted, where we were going around this idea that, you couldn't, there were some forms of speech that were just politically incorrect by one side or the other. There were speakers that were invited to college campuses that were, result in demonstrations or protests or being actually disinvited on a couple of occasions. I guess, do you both think that we are entering a different period when it comes to what's acceptable free speech?
I think we're entering an uncomfortable period in at least our political discourse, because no matter what you say, someone's going to be offended. But at this point, it's, I think, important to distinguish between having free speech and desiring free speech without dissent or consequence. So when you see situations like Middlebury where violence breaks out, that's obviously unacceptable. But I think that dissenting and protesting in general is a vital part of the First Amendment as well. So it's this question of where do you bridge the line between comfort on a place that's supposed to be a welcoming place to educate everyone, and that standing up for what you believe in justice and not allowing offensive speech or speech that you think steps on the rights of others to go forth.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I interviewed a Middlebury protester last year when I was doing my episode on free speech, and he kind of made that point, or a point sort of tangential to the one you were making of, he said teachers and administrators at Middlebury who were angry about their protests sort of told them, it's fine for you to protest, but then you need to sit down and let Charles Murray, who was the speaker at Middlebury at that point, you need to let Charles Murray speak. And the protester I spoke to was like, that's not the point of protest. Protest is supposed to be disruptive. And I think you were sort of saying that, like, where's that line? And he was saying, protest is supposed to be disruptive. That's historically always been the reason for protest. Like, standing up and being like, we don't agree, but then sitting down and letting him continue, it doesn't allow you to be the same level of change agent as protesting to the point of shutting down the event does. So that was an interesting perspective, not one, I guess I shouldn't say I don't agree with it, but I think it ends up doing more harm than good. And I think in the Middlebury case, that was certainly true. But it is interesting to note that some of these protesters feel that way and feel like it's only really protest if it's disruptive in some way, and if it really does sort of rattle things.
I find myself reflecting back, and I'll show my age here for a little bit, back to the 60s and early 70s when, as a college student back then, Witness took part in many anti-war demonstrations and other events like that. And what you were just saying there about how the point of it is supposed to be disruptive definitely rang a bell. I mean, because I think back then, I and people who shared certain views on, let's say, the Vietnam War and whether or not that was, we were doing the right thing there. And when we would go out and stage a march down through the middle of a town or something like that, the whole point was, we're going to stop traffic. We're going to, make a nuisance. We're going to get your attention.
Right.
And that's the whole reason why we're here. And I'm sure a lot of those people who were inconvenienced probably thought, well, gee, couldn't they have written a letter to the editor or done something else or stood, silently along a sidewalk holding signs or something like that? So I find myself wondering, okay, is this something new that we're seeing now, or is this really just a replay of the 60s and 70s? Or you could even go back farther in U.S. history to the Civil War, the early 1800s. You look at some of the rhetoric that was bounced around in the early 1800s, and it's like it makes what we're seeing today, even on Twitter and other social media platforms, pretty tame.
Yeah. Well, I think what's new is that the sides have switched. Is now you have the left seemingly being the ones shutting down free speech, and you have the right who are sort of the protectors of it. Like conservatives are protecting it, and liberals are seemingly attacking it. So that feels new. Because if you look at in the 60s and 70s, I mean, you had Berkeley, which is now being one of the biggest schools for shutting down speakers. Berkeley was like, the birthplace of the free speech movement in the 60s. So that feels like an interesting new twist. I don't know so much, I don't know if either of you know, in terms of further back, left versus right on this issue, but certainly within recent history, the fact that it's the left who's not protecting it is new.
Yeah. I don't know, it seems like the more we progress forward, there's always kind of a backlash, and that's how a lot of people have described the Trump era after the Obama years. But I think that there's also so much emotion and anger in our political discourse right now, and then you have that amplified across social media, so it feels a lot bigger and it feels a lot more dire. And I think that when that emotion just builds up and that dialogue becomes even more intense, and you're kind of in an echo chamber online of people that agree with you, it's so much easier to kind of break out in that riot almost that you saw at Middlebury. And then the question becomes really, how do you make that change? Do you get their attention through protest and dissent and shutting down the event? Or do you make progress by allowing the moderator of that event to ask hard questions and allow that dialogue to move forward and feel comfortable or capable to defend your own position against opposition?
Yeah, I mean, because thinking back to that event in Middlebury, and I don't want to keep on returning to it all the time, although it was one right here in Vermont, and because there have been other cases similar to that elsewhere on other college campuses and in other forums. But I guess I was appalled by what happened there. I thought that it was fine to kind of have a demonstration outside the building, or maybe even before he had a chance to speak, to make him aware that we're not agreeing with you on some of what you've written, but that to keep other people who wanted to listen to him from being able to hear what he had to say was just ridiculous, and just really kind of counter to a more tolerant view that I think would be a benefit to everybody.
Well, it's interesting. I had a lot of thoughts while you were just saying that. But, I mean, one thing that I found really frustrating about the Middlebury protest was, for example, they broke out in a chorus of racist, sexist, anti-gay, Charles Murray, go away. And Charles Murray has actually pretty openly advocated for gay marriage. So among a lot of these protests, what I find most frustrating is there is also a lack of I almost want to say intellectualism to it, and certainly a lack of facts about the reality. And many of the protesters, this came up in the episode I did, had not read any of Charles Murray's works, and they relied singularly on secondary sources about his works. And I read 3 of his books, and I didn't feel like the secondary sources they relied on accurately captured it. And that's unnerving to me. And you mentioned the tolerance piece. And one of the books I'd read in advance of my free speech episode talked about Oliver Wendell Holmes, and there was a quote in there, and it's like, tolerance is the twin of incredulity. And sort of this, which came up throughout the book, of this sense that you can't really to have tolerance, you need to have doubt, right? You need to have doubt that you're right, to allow that maybe somebody else, like you could say, maybe I'm wrong and maybe this person is right, and that's how you're truly tolerant of somebody. And it feels like what you see in these protests is a complete absence of doubt. And you have these protesters who feel so certain they're right, despite not having read the person's work or not having done this. And so there does feel like there's an intolerance there, that if you're not allowing yourself to have any doubt about your own rightness, then you're being intolerant. And that is concerning to me.
I think that kind of, sorry, go ahead.
No.
Oh, I was going to say, it kind of naturally follows from the polarization that we're experiencing right now. And it just makes it so hard if the whole kind of crowd that you normally agree with is passionate about this one issue. Why even bother to do your own research and look into it if, when you do speak out, you're completely chastised across the realm?
In that echo chamber, like you were saying.
Exactly, yeah. And you can't dissent because there's no tolerance for that. And I feel like that's a bigger problem in our political discourse right now than the issue with college campuses, to be honest.
Go ahead.
No.
Well, I was going to jump. We don't have to leave the Middlebury one, but I do have a thought on another protest that went on that we can go to at some point.
Sure, let's go now.
And this would be an example where I almost think protesters may have been right. Milo Yiannopoulos, he was an editor at Breitbart. He recently left, but he's an incredibly controversial figure. I think his talk at Berkeley was canceled, I'm pretty sure. But he had spoken at University of Wisconsin or Wisconsin-Madison, somewhere, and he's a gay man, but he's very sort of, he says kind of horrendous things about women and about trans, folks. And at the speech he gave at this university, he actually put up a photo of a specific trans woman who went to that university and like kind of mocked her specifically. And that felt to me like where you're starting to draw that line, you're starting to touch that line of clear and present danger, where by singling somebody out with a photograph who goes to that university and sort of mocking them, you're potentially inciting violence or certainly some sort of bullying against them. So that I thought was an interesting case of like, should future schools, like does Berkeley then have a right to cancel Milo's talk because to them he has presented a threat to students in the past, which is an interesting case.
That was the case, I think, where they spent like $500,000 or maybe $50,000
on like security,
a lot of security, and were really worried that they were going to have a very violent situation on their hands.
Did he speak at Berkeley?
Yeah, at Berkeley.
Did he end up speaking?
No.
I think they canceled it. Yeah,
they had to cancel it.
Which again, like ordinarily, I am staunchly opposed to that, and I think you should let people speak. But in this case, because of Milo's past.
Yeah.
Speaking at campuses and sort of calling out individual students, I felt more mixed on that one.
Yeah, one could have to understand why.
You feel like you're right. You're presenting a danger. Yeah.
As opposed to trying to kind of create a dialogue around some, at least attempt to kind of like think about things in a deep way.
Which Murray certainly does, because Murray has some really interesting ideas, and it's a shame that people are so unwilling to hear some of them.
So if I'm just wondering if this phenomenon that we're seeing now has its roots kind of maybe like so many other things in the recession of 08-09 and the political climate that he developed out of that, the polarization that we've seen that you referenced there a moment ago, where the schism in American politics seems to be much broader than it was, at least in the more recent past. Now, again, we've had these periods of polarization. Thinking back to the 60s again, and sometimes I think, this ain't nothing compared to 1968. But it is a case, it seems like, where we have this sort of division. And I guess I just wonder if that really feeds into it. And then you add in the social media aspect where people can like dash off stuff anonymously almost, kind of, trash and bash other people. And, you never really, that definitely is a new element, I think.
It
we
is.
didn't have before.
And it's difficult because I feel like if you land on any sort of middle ground on issues, even if you are passionate about them, then you're almost not welcome in the conversation. I mean, I've, for my entire life, considered myself a really avid feminist. And in the Me Too movement now, I think that really wonderful things are happening, and a lot of forward progress is going to grow out of the dialogue that's happening now. But I also wonder, it does seem like this dialogue among women is being really stymied almost, because you can't dissent or question, well, is that really true? I mean, obviously most allegations are true, but not all are. And when there's no tolerance for that conversation or that discussion on where people lie on those sort of issues, it's really difficult. And I feel like that applies to a lot of other political conversations happening right now.
Whether or not it's born out of 2008 is an interesting thing. I haven't thought about that, but it would strike me almost that it almost feels more rooted in 9/11, and like even going that far back. And I mean, from like a direct standpoint, you obviously see hate crime against Islamic groups and against Muslims go up then, and so you have sort of a backlash against that by progressives who are saying that's completely unfair. We cannot paint this whole group with this brush. So you have like a really direct kind of social justice issue that comes up there. But I think also that just fear that was bred into society, which I guess you also then had in 2008, that kind of financial fear. And then fears never bring out the best in people, and make people want to get closed-minded and kind of. So from that standpoint, yeah, maybe it would be 2008. I started saying it's 9/11, and now I'm saying 2008 probably contributed to it as well.
Actually, I think you're probably more accurate. Probably the world changed enormously for the U.S. after 9/11. I mean, we went from, I think, a period of relative prosperity during the 90s and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the U.S. being the sole remaining superpower, and liberal democracy had triumphed. And we had this one brief moment where it seemed like, oh, well, things are finally going to settle down and we're at the end of history or whatever. And then along came 9/11 and everything changed all over again.
Yeah.
And we're still basically dealing with the aftermath of 9/11.
Yeah. I think your point on fear is really well taken as well. And I think that actually almost both of those scenarios are playing out right now, because with 9/11, there was this fear that, at least from what you mentioned, and I think this is true as well, is that a lot of minorities began to fear for their own, and that's
You're right.
my white privilege really showing. But it came to the dialogue more that we need to ensure that all members of our society feel safe and equal, including Muslims or African Americans or everyone else. And I think that fear is still really present on the left. And anytime a new policy comes out of Washington, there's that fear that we're losing or further kind of ruining that cohesion and that safety for all members. But then on the right, you've also got this big financial fear, the fear that they're losing their livelihoods. And I mean, I see both of those playing out kind of simultaneously.
Yeah, absolutely.
If that makes sense.
And that's where, I think the election of Obama scared people on the right, obviously, in a big way. And, there was probably racism connected to that. And then you obviously have the election of Donald Trump, which has really made the left terrified. And so I think absolutely these protests that we're seeing cannot be separated from the election of Donald Trump. And this sense that there's an increasingly impending need to protect minority rights, because we could be an executive order away from stripping those away. So I think that is an important part of this. And when we talk about, is this different or is this new? To the extent that everything under Trump feels different and new, it is, right? And because it is still a reaction to that. So it'll be interesting if, God willing, for example, he wasn't elected in 2020, to see what happened on campuses and if you saw this trend continue or if you saw it actually kind of abate a bit.
Yeah. I mean, I've often wondered, if the outcome of the presidential election in 2016 had been different, would we be seeing some of the same, stress
I don't think we would.
Angst and whatnot. Which leads me to another question I wanted to run by both of you. What is your assessment on the whole concern about the so-called meddling in the 2016 election by foreign governments, particularly the Russian government is one most frequently mentioned, used Facebook trolls and bots in one form or another to kind of, spread false information and fake news, if you will, about what was going on in the election. I mean, it seems to me there's a free speech component to this as well, and I'm not sure I've sorted it all out yet in my head, but it's kind of like, we now with this new mechanism for communicating with people, and now it's being used in a way that was never done before, at least to the extent that it was used in 2016. I mean, and we don't know yet if that changed the outcome or not. It may be, the same result would have happened. But I find myself wondering, with if we're going to be entering a period where that kind of manipulation of social media is going to be a fact of life. I mean, how does that impact free speech? I mean, does it mean we have to be even more careful about, not being so open-minded and tolerant about free speech? Because if we're going to be subjected to a lot of fake information that's deliberately false.
Well, I think what it does is it makes this trend now even more troubling from the standpoint of what we were talking about earlier. Like, you already have people who are in these echo chambers who are so inclined to only hear and listen to and believe what they want to hear and listen to. So those are folks who are probably going to be less vigilant against fake information that says what they want to hear. And that's true on both sides, really. So, I think the injection of truly fake news into our social media spheres and our world is definitely the worst possible thing we could have in our current state of hyperpolarization and not listening to each other. In terms of what you do about it, I don't know that there is a way for Facebook or for these social media platforms to shut that news down. And I probably wouldn't advocate it because I think it's what's hyperbole, what's spin, what's truly patently false. I mean, I think it gets really tricky to draw those lines, and I don't know that I want Facebook doing that. I think that is an infringement of free speech. I don't think that's even I don't know that they're even capable of doing that now. But I mean, to whatever extent you can have verification, and you have sites like Snopes, I think, does it, but there are different sites that will fact check things. So a rise in that would be good, and but I don't know. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the Russian meddling issues, too, are that they were trying to amplify that polarization that already exists.
Right.
And a big problem, too, with the Facebook policies is that, yes, they are cracking down on the fake news aspect, and in a lot of ways that's a good thing, but they're also cracking down on legitimate news. Legitimate publications are going to be kind of deprioritized in their news feed. So then you also have maybe less fake news coming at you from social media, but also less legitimate facts coming your way, and less papers able to provide that, or publications, not just papers, because their readers aren't finding their content.
I mean, a couple thoughts that came out of that. One, you had claims, and I don't know if this is true or not, but on the conservative side, that Facebook and these sites have always deprioritized conservative news and have always, upped, liberal news sources. I don't know if that's true or not, but that would be a free speech issue if that was true. But also, I mean, to an extent, what was coming up for me was this idea was net neutrality, right? And we're all freaked out by the idea of corporations getting to decide how fast a website can load, or corporations having the power to determine sources of news that way. And there's sort of a parallel there if we're letting Facebook prioritize or deprioritize things, where what you're able to find online is very much being determined by these big companies. And I haven't thought much about this at all, so I don't know if I feel like there's a hypocrisy there to say, I support net neutrality, but I also support Facebook, fitzing with its algorithms and determining what I can see on my newsfeed. I don't know if I think there's a conflict there, but I think there could be, because it strikes me that you're talking about a sort of similar premise.
Mm-hmm. So where do you think we go from here to kind of fix this, if this is a problem that needs fixing? I mean, do we have to wait until the anger on the right and the anger on the left sort of subside because, I don't know, people feel like wealth is being more evenly distributed, and some of the angst that fueled President Trump's election dissipates to some degree, or is this a case where people who are kind of being really out there trying to advocate for certain points of view really have to look in the mirror and say, okay, there's a certain point beyond which I really can't push this any further, and I'm just going to let the merits of my argument either call the shots, or do we or is it just going to have to be we're just going to sit back and kind of just await further developments and see where things take us?
I think it's really important that we kind of all roll up our sleeves and do the hard work at this point and actually invest in a dialogue, because until that happens, I don't think any progress is going to really come out of this anger and polarization that's happening right now. I mean, you so often see people just making decisions based on the larger crowd or based on their political identity, and that's not going to get better if we water down the discussions on those really difficult issues, because there's not going to be an easy answer most of the time, and it's going to be really uncomfortable. And that's kind of why free speech needs that constitutional protection in the first place, because it does suck most of the time to get into those discussions, and it's painful and it's offensive and it's uncomfortable, but it's what needs to happen for our national consciousness, I think, to shift forward in any kind of meaningful way.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I totally agree with all that. But I also am hopeful, and talking about the constitutional thing, this is something that came up between the three of us earlier, but like this, putting this in perspective, which is that we're not seeing arrests, you know, like, and these protests that are happening on college campuses, none of these students are calling for these speakers to be put in prison. Right, so from that standpoint, you're not seeing an infringement really on that First Amendment and on that constitutional right to speech. You're seeing individuals on a campus saying, I don't want this speaker on my individual campus, and that's alarming because it shows a closed-mindedness among college students who are historically some of the most open-minded people, and that open-mindedness, I think, is a really good thing. So it's disturbing from that standpoint, but I don't think it's at a point where it's disturbing on like a national censorship, you know, Chinese, Russian media, you know, shutting down journalists standpoint. And even Trump, who, you know, has been, you know, excoriates fake news and, you know, says CNN is fake news, and all that could be seen
and
as...
not Fox.
Right. And that's, so you can say that his excoriating those is a scary thing, because it seems like you've got this president who has this, you know, real animosity with the press. He's not arresting, you know, Chris Cuomo. Like he's not seemingly using like our, you know, military might to shut down like, you know, opponent voices or opposition voices. And the Fox News piece is important too, because you still do have both sides being heard. You know, Middlebury shuts down Charles Murray. Charles Murray is on every, I don't know that he was actually invited on Fox News, but Fox News is airing that everywhere and giving voice to his opinions. So that polarization is a problem, but I don't fear that we're at this point where our liberties are really being stripped away. I think it's a really important thing to keep talking about, and for people who are interested in it and invested in it to really do their homework and understand issues, and not, you know, to look into Charles Murray, to look into Milo Yiannopoulos, to look into these situations and not just take it at face value. But I'm not so concerned that we're all heading for a fascist dictatorship yet.
It's not 1930.
I'm not yet. I'm not worried yet. Well, I mean, I'm a little worried, but I'm not panicking.
You're right. I mean, I too am reassured. You know that there definitely seems to be a vigorous and strong movement. You know, the Women's March in early January 2017. We've seen other demonstrations of people being able to speak openly. The immigration situation at the airports there, on those executive orders. That's another example. I think people, you know, being able to, without fear of being thrown into jail for, you know, completely ridiculous reasons or trumped up charges, pun intended, to be able to do that. And I agree that, you know, the feeling I think is still that we still are very much of a free society and able to do that. It's just, you know, I find it troubling that there just seems to be this growing level of intolerance on both sides for a different point of view, that you can't, it just seems so hard for so many people to sit down and say, okay, I think this, but, you know, somebody else thinks the polar opposite. Now, why do they think that?
Right.
What is it about their background or personal history that put them here? And it's funny when you start thinking about, okay, well, if I had grown up wherever instead of where I did, you know, I'd probably have different views too.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, all right. Well, interesting stuff, and maybe we'll have to have you all back again at some point to unpackage other deep concepts that we need to
I'm down.
wrestle with. And thank all of you. Thank you also for being with us today. This has been GNAT TV's In-Depth series. Hope you've enjoyed the show, and we'll see you the next time. Have a great day.